your name. Jesus, your name. Power in your name. Healing in your name. Jesus. Go on, stir it up. Speak out the name that is above every name. Glorify the name. Glorify the name. Oh, Jesus, Jesus. Jesus, Jesus. surrender to Him. Surrender to Jesus this morning. Jesus, Jesus. We lift you high, we lift you high. Jesus. Oh, Jesus. 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 Oh, la, 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 la. Jesus. La, 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 sia costone. Siara, siara, ne. Sikiara, kosiga, manare. Siloro, sunyana, mokoshikara. Siara, ne. Kiyono, yamamasiki.
This morning, as we go through this small passage of scripture, that you can see something from what Jesus does, which will be something that you can do in your own life, and it will make a difference. He taught through his interaction. He taught through the conversation. He taught through his conversations, and he also taught through his interaction with the Pharisees and with the Sadducees in multiple different times and ways. It says, if you can imagine this little girl, synagogue leader's daughter, has somehow become ill and she's passed away. He arrives at his house, the synagogue leader's house. There's already a crowd there. Why would there be a crowd? I'd say the synagogue leader was probably well loved by the people. Synagogue leader would have been caring for the people that were under his responsibility. And the people that he was well connected to would have been mourning with him the passing of his daughter. And I think, in my circumstance, in many ways our girls have become part of the church. And while they, especially when they were younger, didn't have any role or position or authority, they were loved by the church because they were at the church every time everyone came. They were there at times when they were little asleep. There were other times where they were running around getting themselves in trouble. They were helping eat the communion when they ought not to have helped eat the communion. That's in the old days where we'd have it, and it'd be, we'd catch the kids later on and they're cleaning up the communion, not clearing up, but cleaning up as in eating what was left. And so our kids were part of the church and people loved them. Some people thought it was their responsibility to discipline them, which it wasn't. So if you can imagine, this synagogue leader's daughter has passed away. And so there's a crowd that's gathered, and they're not only mourning the passing of this little girl, but they're sharing in the grief with this synagogue leader. They're trying to, as it were, lift the load a little about the tragedy that had happened. And Jesus walks into the crowd, and it's not that the crowd were doing the wrong thing. They just had a different perspective to Jesus. But the crowd, they'd have been putting on a show because it apparently helps with grief. And, in some places, the way they grieve is quite different from us here in Australia. They cry and they squeal and they scream and they yell, and they think that somehow that alleviates some of the pain and the suffering that the loved ones that have lost their loved one are going through. It's possible that the little girl was going to be buried perhaps even later that night, if not early the next morning. And so the crowd is doing its best to express their grief for this little girl, and Jesus walks into the crowd. And he basically says, get out. Go away. Leave leave us alone. And the crowd, or it says in the passage that I read, it says the crowd laughed at him. Jesus has already had a big day. I mean, if he responded to the crowd in the way I would have, he'd have probably just walked out. He's already tired. He's already weary. He's already been, if you like, beaten up by the challenge of the Pharisees. He's beaten up by the challenge of the people around about who were criticizing him because he'd met with Matthew. He's also had the people on his side, John the Baptist's followers, questioning what he's doing. He's getting near to the end of the day, and the crowd are laughing at him because he's telling them to go away. He's trying to explain that the girl's not dead, which she was dead. And he's trying to get rid of them. Clearly, the synagogue leader believed what Jesus was saying because it was probably him that arranged for the crowd to depart. I want to question you about your position and your commitment to the crowd. Whatever you do in a normal day, there's a crowd around about you. That crowd may be in the form of people, but it's more likely to be in the form of media, of some form or another. It's an harassment that continues and works its way at you. In this circumstance, the crowd was supposed to be helping the synagogue leader and his family in their grief, but there's a crowd around you all of the time. And there are times in our life when, like what Jesus did there in this circumstance, you need to tell the crowd to go away. You need to find a way to gain some solitude. And the reason you need to do that is because if Jesus wants to do something in your life, it's normally separate and away from the crowd's intentions and plans. The second thing that Jesus did here, if you look at it, is he took the little girl by the hand. I remember I was in grade 1, I think, and going to school, and I liked this girl at school. And I know grade 1's really young, but that's just how it was, you know. And somehow I got positioned next to this girl. Her name was Leonie, and we held hands. And I got in trouble from the teacher. I don't know how come I got in trouble, but anyway. But you know, there was something which I can still recall in my mind. I can't remember what she looked like, but I can recall the intimacy of holding hands with this girl. I want you to think about the times where you've held hands with somebody. There's the uncomfortable time, perhaps, and churches do it a lot. They say, okay, let's everyone hold hands. And you're thinking, oh, I don't want to hold hands with that person. It's not necessarily intimate, but there is a level of intimacy that we're normally uncomfortable with. But I can imagine Nico when he was younger. There would have been a point at some stage or another where he gently, put his arm up and around or across and somehow grabbed Joanne's hand. Can you remember when it was? Or was it the other way around? That holding hands for the first time, it's an intimate thing. You know, you can feel the warmth of somebody else's hand, or sadly, sometimes you can feel the sweat of somebody else's hand. Or holding hands is an intimate thing. And, you know, from time to time, you know, I still walk along, and sometimes in the shopping center, Ruth wants to hold my hand. If I want to hold her hands, I get in trouble. Do you know why? Because I walk at a much faster pace from my wife, and when I hold hands, it's like I'm dragging her along. She says, I'm not holding your hand, you're just trying to make me walk faster. So there's some intimacy lost in those moments. But you know, holding hands, it's an intimate thing normally. I don't know if you've been in a hospital where someone's near the end of their life and you hold their hands. You don't say anything necessarily, but you just sit there and you hold their hands in an attempt to convey something. What's conveyed when a hand is held? Well, it's different in every different circumstance, but usually it's love, usually it's care, usually it's concern, usually it's a sense of reassurance. I know, you know, one guy, he's still in our church. He's 88 now, and he's been my prayer partner for, I don't lost count of the years, 23, 24 years, 22 years, I think. But I remember his wife sadly suffered a stroke about 8 years ago and passed dramatically and quickly. And he still suffers with grief as a result of losing his wife. But I can remember at the time, when he rang me and I went straight to the hospital and I was there with him and I just held hands with him. I didn't know what to say. But all I could do was convey my care and my concern for him at that moment. Now, Jesus asks the crowd to go away. And what he does is he takes a hold of the little girl's hands. Now, he wasn't alone. Some of the disciples were with him. Parents were there as well. But he holds this little girl's hand. Can I ask you a question? When was the last time you created a circumstance that was quiet enough, that was intimate enough for Jesus to hold your hand? He wants to talk to you. He wants to communicate with you. We know that in this particular passage, it doesn't relay the words that were said. But we know in Mark, in chapter 5, it relays some of the words that he would have said, but just the touch of his hand. Jesus wants to hold your hand. Now, I don't know what your circumstance is. I don't know what you're going through. There are times of excitement. There are times of pain. There are times of pressure. There are times of busyness. And too often what happens is, rather than allowing the crowd to go away, rather than pushing the crowd away, we let the crowd stay. And when the crowd stays, the probability, the likelihood of us experiencing the hand holding of Jesus, it decreases dramatically. Can I ask you this week ahead to find some time to push the crowd away so Jesus can hold your hand? When Jesus held the hand of the little girl, something profound happened. The little girl that was dead came to life. Her body responded to what Jesus said. We know in Mark, basically what Jesus said was, little girl, stand up. And if I can say this carefully but strongly, Jesus wants to talk to each one of you. And I believe that he wants to say exactly the same thing. And you might say, but I'm not dead. You're wrong there. There are parts of your life that still need new life to be invested into them. And what Jesus wants to do is he wants to take you by the hand and he wants to say, little boy, little girl, stand up. You may be under pressure in your work situation. You may be being persecuted. It's time to stand up. It may be that you feel beaten up because of your financial situation. It may be some relational difficulty. Jesus wants to take you by the hand and he wants to encourage you to stand up. He wants that which you're losing, that which feels like it's gone, that which is lost, to experience new life. And Jesus, even this moment, he wants to take you by the hand and he wants to breathe new life, into your circumstance, into your situation, and he wants to encourage you to stand up. You know, what we need to do is we need to hear what Jesus has to say. Not only do we need to take him by the hand, but we need to unblock our ears so that the things the world is saying become, if you like, blocked out, and what he's saying becomes dominant and foremost in our thinking. Jesus wants to do something in your life. Now, I don't know, like I've said before, I don't know what your circumstance is, but it doesn't actually matter because Jesus does know. It doesn't matter what your objection is because Jesus does know. But it starts with this, you need to push the crowd away. The crowd is all around us. And sadly for most of us, the crowd is in here. And Peter said earlier, before there was a crown placed on Jesus' head. Well, ultimately what we need to do is push the crowd from off our head and allow the crown of Jesus to take its place. We need what Jesus has said to dominate our thinking, to dominate our actions, to dominate our feelings, to dominate our attitudes. We need to allow the words of Christ to bring life to us in our situation. There will be times where you feel beaten up. There will be times where you feel tired. There will be times where you feel like you want to walk away, where you want to give it all up. Don't you think Jesus must have felt that way sometimes? When I look at a day in the life of Jesus, I think, man, sometimes I complain about my day, but when I look at what Jesus went through in a day, I think, wow, that's extraordinary. But he persisted, he pushed through. Now let's remember, we know he's the Son of God, but he was also a man just like us. He still got tired, he still got hungry, he still got the pressure that came from the people all around about him, and yet he persisted and he pushed through. And the reason he did was because he'd found a moment and a time where the crowd was gone, and time after time we read of how Jesus got away to a quiet place, got away to a place where he was alone, and he talked to his heavenly Father. It may have been late at night, it could have been early in the morning, but he got away to a place where Jesus was able to hear from his Father, and there he was restored. There he was strengthened again. There he was able to be refueled, if we can put it that way, so he could get out and do the things that he was called to do. Don't think you're so different. Don't think that Jesus hasn't got a plan for your life. Don't think that somehow, some way you're less than somebody else. The only difference between you and somebody else is whether or not you're hearing what Christ has got in mind for you to do in the day that lies ahead. This is not about who's important, it's about who's useful. And the reality is this: we are all useful to God if we're able to hear what it is that he's asking us to do. God doesn't prioritize people. He doesn't actually put one above another. What he does is he determines who's putting him above everything else. It's around the other way. What's important to God is whether or not you're placing him in his place of importance. Now this morning, my voice has some prominence only because everyone else is not talking at the moment. And I appreciate that. But it's only got value if you respond to what I say. What I say means nothing unless it finds its way out into practice. And it's not actually what I'm saying, it's what we're learning from this passage of Scripture that makes the difference. And so, when it comes to impacting the world around you, in your workplace, in your homes, in your schools, in the universities, in your neighborhoods, the answer is simple. Push the crowd away, grab a hold of Jesus' hand, hear what he's got to say, and then stand up in the way that he wants you to stand up. Let's look at the final part of that particular passage. Verse 26 says this: the report of this miracle swept through the entire countryside. The work of Christ today is no different to what it was a year ago, 10 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. When God does something in somebody's life, it ought to be shared abroad. The good news is always the good news. The good news continues on, and it continues on because we, if you like, allow it to reverberate not only in our own ears but in the lives of those around about. What do you think the synagogue leader was saying for the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? My daughter was dead, but then she came back to life. Tell us the story again. My daughter was dead, and then this man came in. He said he was the Messiah. He told the crowd to go away. He took her by the hand, and he told her to stand up. And I thought I'd lost her, but now she's alive. And she's now, in her 50s or 60s or however old. The story would have kept going on and on and on and on. And there are stories that you've got of what God has done. And the intention is for those stories to be noised abroad, to be the good news no matter what the circumstance, no matter what the situation. I became a Christian at the age of 16. We had two neighbours, John and Karen. They're here today, a different John and Karen. I see, where are they seated? Oh, there they are. John and Karen, not the same John and Karen, but the same names. And this man John, not this man John, but another John, not John the Baptist either, but another John. This fireman, he was an evangelistic guy. As a young kid, I was from a non-Christian background, doing all the things that I ought not to be doing. But he persisted with me. And he kept telling me about Jesus. I remember he got me to the point where I committed to read the book of Genesis. And I'm thinking, I read through the book of Genesis and I'm thinking, right, whatever. He said to me, after I'd read the book of Genesis, he said, how did you go? I said, well, what do you mean, how did I go? I read the book. He said, did God speak to you? I said, no. He said, do you know why? I said, no. He said, well, you've got to receive Jesus into your heart for the Bible to speak into your heart. I said, why don't you tell me that before I just went through 50 chapters? I felt like he ripped me off. And he explained to me what I needed to do. And I can recall making a decision to follow Jesus Christ when I was 16. I was in a caravan. I was with my mum and dad. We were away. And John and Karen were with us on this holiday in Queensland. And I was in the caravan on the top bunk, and my sister was on the bottom bunk. I was older by a year, so it was right. It's not a male-female thing, because someone got offended when I said that one time. I was a year older, so I got the top bunk. That was why. But there in my bed, quietly to myself, without anyone else, I just simply said, hey, Jesus, if you're real, I want to know you. I want to be forgiven for my sin, and I want to begin a relationship with you. And let me say, I say this respectfully, but I don't think I said it in faith. I said it because John told me to say it, and I just wanted to see if it would work. And it did work. That night I couldn't sleep. I didn't tell my mum and dad, didn't tell my sister. We're all in close proximity, but the crowd had gone. Jesus somehow on that night come and took my hand, and there was no doubt, and there is still no doubt, that Jesus came and filled my heart that night. That story will keep getting told time after time after time. You've got a story to tell, but you've got more stories to create. And the way the stories will be created is by pushing the crowd away, letting Jesus take you by the hand, hearing his words to stand up in your situation, and then there'll be another story to tell, and the good news will reach many others about Jesus Christ.